we've been delighted to have Andy as a visitor for the whole week. Many people had also the opportunity to interact with him on other occasions. I think it has been a very fruitful visit, which culminates today with the last lecture, about which we've heard already, at least from the teasing announcements. So we're all looking forward to this third lecture on body interoception and many more things. Andy, please.
Okay, thank you, and thanks everyone. But is this right? Is this booming a bit? Is it too high up? Is that better? Okay. So thanks for hanging in there to the end of these. So, as you know, I started off by looking at perception, then we looked at action. And this one is about kind of inner perception. So looking at the kind of predicting our own visceral states and what sorts of differences that might make to stuff. There is a sort of missing bit of this puzzle, which I might as well just admit to now, because if there'd been lots more lectures and I knew a lot more about it, then we could have started to look at how adding the visceral stuff can then be put back together with action again. And I bet that's going to make a big difference, but we're not going to get that far. But certainly a good thing to be thinking about. Okay, so thanks to everyone that made this possible. It's been fantastic. It's been an honour and a delight, and hanging out with everyone has been great. Special thanks to Carl Friston, the architect of a lot of this. Also to Barry, Ophelia, Richard, the Institute, the School of Advanced Studies, the University of London, and Shamil Chandaria, the benefactor of these lectures. Right, also, last time around, but I'm thanking my mum each time round for these. She died as I was preparing to deliver them, and I think I was expecting to do them in June. She died in April, and so quick word for her. Okay, right. So what's been going on, and I won't spend too long rehearsing it because that would obviously be crazy, but I'm going to rehearse it just a little tiny bit. The thought that's been emerging is that it might be good to think about the brain as a kind of multi-level probabilistic prediction machine. Something which is busy trying to predict the incoming sensory signal, the barrage of stuff hitting all of our different sense organs, moment by moment. So if these stories are right, then what you experience now is always a very delicate combination of what you were expecting the incoming sensory barrage to be like, and what you get as evidence from the incoming sensory barrage. So experience wouldn't be constructed, as it were, in a feed-forward way, just responding to what's out there. Instead, your expectations and anticipations will be making a huge difference. This is probably a good way to think about this, I think, is that the brain here is sorting the interesting signal from the noise, using what you know about the world to help sort out what's interesting or important in the current sensory barrage. So every time I've started one of these, we've had an example. There's one more example here. Here it is. Have a look at that. Most people probably can't really see what that is. Anyone see what that is? Doesn't really matter. You'll see it in a minute. But some people might have seen it before, of course. That's, you've already got the right model. So there it is. It's just a lot of noise, probably, like those Dalmatian pictures, but everyone's seen the Dalmatian. That's different. And there's what it is. You see it now. Now if you go back to it now, you can all see it. You can't, you see it yet? Okay, we're going to do this one more time. There's the thing. There's what you're seeing. So, this is maybe ears, ears, nose, cow. So once you've got the right model, your brain can sort the signal out from the noise, and this is perhaps what it takes to bring a structured world into view, using the senses. That at least is the claim that's been put on the table. It is a cow, isn't it? Yes. Right. So if these stories are right, then this isn't, if you like, just a trick for dealing with difficult cases. It's not just a trick that the brain uses when the sensory information is ambiguous or rather rather bad. Instead, the idea will be that this is a phrase I've used before here, the thought will be this is a fundamental operating principle of the brain. It's basically what most of the brain is doing most of the time, and it would underlie the whole of perception, thought and action. So it's, nothing if not an ambitious attempt at a unifying story. So crucially, in all these stories, it's mismatches with what you were expecting that get to drive further processing. So you're expecting a certain barrage of sensory information at many different levels. Those expectations, if you like, meet the incoming sensory signal, and then residual errors are generated and pass through the system. Those errors are basically saying this was interesting, this was newsworthy, this is something you should care about. So when there are no prediction errors, your expectations are already perfect and there's no more to do. So what I want to do today is to sketch something of the way that various people, some of them in this room, I particularly mention Anil Seth, Lisa Feldman-Barrett and Carl Friston, have been trying to extend this picture to deal with stuff that it doesn't so obviously easily apply to, like feelings, desires, goals, motivations, and along the way to say something about conscious experience. So, the story I gave you there's nothing in particular about consciousness there. Maybe we can say more about consciousness today. Okay. So, I guess a worry that I want to raise by the end of today is you might worry that this story has now got too big. Once you sort of sweep everything up in its path, experience, emotion, action, perception, motivation, planning, reasoning, maybe it's just got too good, too big, too neat, too galactic to be true. This is the well-named Sombrero Galaxy from the Hubble telescope. So what can we say from this perspective about conscious experiences? I think there's a very gentle, rather obvious place to start. There's a lot of good work showing that if you're predicting a stimulus quite strongly, then it enters conscious experience more quickly and it's dealt with more efficiently. So in a way this is kind of obvious, but there are experiments that show this. Experiment we'll just look at briefly here, something from Lucia Meloni and colleagues. What they show is that the onset time that it takes to form a reportable conscious percept can vary by up to about 100 milliseconds according to whether you're expecting this thing to come along or not. So they basically just showed people these sort of rather faint stimuli, got them to assess absolute visibility, got them to the sort of top of that where they really can see it, and then took them down to the bottom again, making it sort of weaker and weaker. And what they showed was that the place where you say, now I've just started to see it on the way up, that actually requires a stronger signal to make you say that you're just starting to see it than it does on the way down, where you want to say, okay, this is the point at which I stop seeing it. So that's what they did. Modified the dot intensity of the target shape, keeping the noise constant, altering the signal-noise ratio. Apt expectations lower the absolute visibility threshold for conscious experience. And it's interesting that, if you're one of the people that wants to find the neural correlates of conscious experience, if you don't control for prediction in this way, then you might get confused about what the correlates are, because they're different according to whether you have apt predictions in place or not. So there are, I think, experimental implications here. And you see this in lots of other places that are clearly to do with conscious stuff. Predictions about our own states of pain make a big difference to the amounts of pain we experience. Doing some work on this with Mick Thacker, who was going to make it today but couldn't, unfortunately. But the thought here is that the brain doesn't sort of just passively wait for information saying something like, I don't know, damage is going on at some part of the body, sort of pain, nociceptive information. Instead, it's busy predicting the arrival and the intensity of that kind of information. So there's some nice reviews of this. Lots of examples. So these are sort of Brown and colleagues using heat stimuli to induce different pain intensities. So there's sort of something in there making your hand hot. And what they were doing was varying your expectations about the magnitude of the pain and varying the certainty, the reliability of your expectations about the magnitude of the pain. And then seeing how you rated the pain and, using something like a slider here. So you just rate the pain on the slider and you're given a sort of absolute, some kind of intensity. It's a thermal thing, so it's a sort of thermal heating element in there. So what they found is that high intensity, painful stimuli are perceived as more painful when they're cued with high certainty. That's to say, you set up a reliable expectation of intense pain. And conversely, low intensity painful stimuli are perceived as less painful when the low intensity pain is cued with high certainty. So what's happening here is that the certainty is just amplifying what you expect, really. So both of these effects disappear when the cue-induced expectations are estimated by you to be unreliable. So you can either give people reliable cues or unreliable cues and see how they do. So I think this fits very well with the story we looked at over the last couple of sessions. Fits with the idea that estimates of precision, estimated reliability, inverse variance in statistical terms, are determining the balance between your expectations and the incoming sensory evidence. So under conditions where you think that stuff has high reliability, then in that case you will take your own predictions more seriously than you would in the other cases. Okay. Same story for placebo analgesia. This is painkilling effects obtained using inert substances, ones with no real painkiller in them. That's surprisingly effective. And again, the efficacy of placebos for analgesia varies very delicately with how strong the expectation of the analgesic effects is. So you can describe the potency of the effect that you're about to get differently, and that will affect how powerful the effect itself is. So these are kind of well-known effects. We'll all have read about these at different times. But it seems to me that what PP is providing here, and what it does in a lot of cases, is a sort of unifying framework in which an awful lot of this stuff just kind of falls into place. It's just more of the brain trying to predict the flow of sensory inputs and combine the incoming stuff with its expectations to generate a percept. So an awful lot of stuff, I think, begins to fall into place there. Quite generally, human experience on these models reflects not just what's coming in at you from the outside, but what you expect to be coming in at you from the outside. And I think that this is probably a game changer for thinking about the mind and for thinking about experience. And here's the first of my many little black slides, because I know that I get a bit breathless and do too much talking, so this is a sort of moment to reset your expectations. So, game changer or not, doesn't really seem to have quite got there yet with conscious experience. Nothing I've said really will make you think that you're getting a handle on why there is conscious experience rather than no conscious experience. Maybe it gives you a handle on, why you rate something as more intense than something else, why you see this thing under this amount of noise and not under this amount. But not why you should see anything at all, not why it should be like anything to see anything at all. So this is skirting close to the so-called hard problem of conscious experience. Of course, I'm a deflationist about this. I don't actually think there is a hard problem of conscious experience. We'll doubtless come back to this in discussion. But if I did think there was a hard problem of conscious experience, some of the stuff I'm about to say would be part of the solution to the problem that isn't actually really there. So, question, can predictive processing offer anything? Well, this is how people think about the hard problem, there's all this stuff going on in your head, but then there's this thing, the loveliness of the rose, the smell of the rose, and you just, there's just more to it than all that, this is, I like this picture, it's just how I feel about it, I don't know quite why they got Mill in there, probably because he's an emergentist or something, but anyway, I like the picture of consciousness. Something is happening, and surely it's not just mechanics. That's the kind of, maybe that's the thought. So what can we say about that? I think maybe just creep up on it a little bit. Certainly not going to get there today, although I think we get closer than it will seem, but that's because I'm a deflationist about the problem. We'll come back to that. So think about the actual form of these probabilistic encodings. I think there's a clue in there. The probabilistic encodings that we were looking at in the last two sessions are all probability density distributions. That's to say, they're They're basically things like, if you're representing the depth of an object, there are a lot of different guesses about what that depth is. So, with so much probability it's sort of that far away, with so much probability it's a bit further away, and so on. That's interesting, but of course experience doesn't seem like that to us at all. It doesn't seem to me as if the world is a big probability density matrix. It seems to me the coal's sitting exactly there, not sort of sitting there with a certain amount of probability and sitting a bit closer with a different amount of probability. So what's going on? Halloween, that's what's going on. So this sort of probabilistic story can, I think, seem at odds with these sorts of facts. You might say, look, the world doesn't look like an intertwined set of probability density distributions. It looks like pumpkins, basically. Looks unitary and on a clear autumn day, unambiguous. So there's this sort of puzzle. It's been raised by other people. Lou Stafford and Fox raised it in a recent paper in Connection Science, where they say, look, why don't we see a Bayesian blur? Why do we see a sort of a unitary focused kind of world? So here's somewhere that it seems like action might be playing a big role. So this goes to what we were talking about last time around, but the kind of thought that the point of all this machinery is to choose the next action. To choose the next action in a sort of way that keeps you alive and viable. Maybe if you're going to make an action decision, there's a reason there for the brain, if you like, to enforce there to be a single peak in that probability density distribution. So this will be enforcing a kind of single overall take on how the world is most likely to be. I think this makes strategic sense. This is, it was Carl Friston that did suggest this to me, first of all. He said, okay, you can only do one thing at a time. So this seems to be true. I'm going to have to go one way or the other way down that road. So because I can only do one thing at a time, maybe that's kind of hooked in some way to the fact that I don't see a delicate probability distribution as a kind of user here, the sort of top-level agent. I kind of need to be informed in a sort of rather coarse way about what to do so that I can factor it into my decisions better. I think there's some thinking there. Something in that region of thinking about action maybe explains why the world doesn't look like a superposed mass of varying probability states. So maybe that's a way of making some progress with that. That would fit with a lot of existing proposals concerning the neural underpinnings of consciousness. We can talk about those in discussion if you like, but it would fit with the idea that stuff that becomes conscious is stuff which has reached some sort of level at which it should be put in a position to control many kinds of report and action. That's a kind of global workspace theory of Bernie Bars. Still, even if something like that begins to make progress with unitariness, it's still not going to get very far towards satisfying a sort of Dave Chalmers type worry here. Why does it feel like anything at all to be a conscious agent deploying this sort of heavy-duty probabilistic machinery to select the next action? What can we say about that, if anything? There's an emerging suggestion in literature here, and this is the sort of inward-looking visceral stuff that I mostly want to put on the table today. So the emerging suggestion is that a lot of the distinctive feel of conscious experience comes from, if you like, putting the sort of story that I was looking at in the last two goes into contact with the same sort of story when it's told for inward-looking perception. So perceiving the states of your own gut and viscera and, heartbeat and so forth. So interoception is the inward sense of the physiological condition of the body. It covers all these sorts of things. Sensual touch, pain, itch, breathlessness, inward-looking states of the gut, and so on. Enriched in this, when you start taking the interoceptive stuff seriously, you're in the ballpark of the James Langer model of emotional experience. So James and Langer argued in slightly different ways that felt emotions were sort of the perception of our own bodily responses to external stimuli and events. And this story, lots of you people here will have been following this story as it's been augmented and refined and re-augmented and re-refined by people like Antonio Damasio and Jesse Prince, and Hugo Critchley and Bud Craig, and a bunch of others. So the thought there is that emotional feelings are inner perceptions of our own varying physiological responses, and that we sort of mistake these for the effects of a felt emotion when really they're part of it. So the thought would be, you've got these interoceptively known things going on, sweating, trembling, increased heart rate. You might think, James and Langer would have said, that they're the effects of the emotion that you're feeling, but actually they're just part of what it is to feel that emotion. They're constitutive elements of the emotion. If you took away all that, so the famous subtraction test, take away all the bodily signs of the emotion, and what's left, if James Langer were right, wouldn't feel like the emotion at all. It would be a sort of hollow shell without the proper emotionality in it. So it's a pretty rough and ready story. There's lots of reasons, good empirical reasons, to be very suspicious of that story if you tell it just like that. What I think you can do with the PP apparatus is kind of tell a subtler version of the story that preserves some of that flavour. So this is a sort of what you could think of as a predictive twist on the story. Emotions and feeling states would be the result of a sort of crunching together of lots of information. So not just looking at your own inner states, but looking at your own inner states in the context of trying to predict the flow of stuff coming from the external world, and in the context of trying to produce actions that take all of that stuff into account. So there's, I think this sort of idea is something like a great big crunch, a big Bayesian crunch, in which you're sort of bringing together predictions about your own internal state, predictions about the external world, knowledge about how variations in your own internal state might be tracking variations in the external world. So, if I detect my heart beating faster, maybe that should contribute to my inferring that I'm in an exciting or dangerous situation or something like that. And at this point, I think we do get close to beginning to have a picture of why, when we perceive the world and when we act in the world, what we perceive is a world that is, if you like, permeated with mattering, a world in which the states that I encounter aren't just states where I might do one thing or another, but states that mean something to me. For example, we see food differently if we're hungry, mountains differently if we're tired, and so on. This seems to kind of make sense here. So there's a particular model that I'm sort of partial to here, maybe it's just because of the name, EPIC, the embodied predictive interoception coding. That's what it is called. I'm not sure if it's entirely grammatical, but that's what it's called anyway, model. So this is what they offer is a detailed neuroanatomical substrate for the kind of big crunch story that I was just giving you. In particular, they're keen on the anterior insula and the singular cortices, which they basically say is a really good place to bring this information together, this inward-looking and outward-looking information. The result, they want to say, is a multisensory representation of the world from the perspective of someone with a body. So this is, still trying to pursue this idea that we need to think about prediction in an embodied, active kind of context. So they stress that interoceptive sensation is itself informed by interoceptive prediction. So it's not just that, as it were, you take in interoceptive information, but rather you're trying to predict the evolving interoceptive state of your own body. And actually, I don't think enough experiments have been done yet on that bit, so we'd like to see more of that. Maybe talk about that in discussion. It does seem as if their sorts of stories make some contact with some hard-to-explain stuff, and some work that I've seen of Carl's does this too. The idea would be that aberrantly generated high-precision interoceptive predictions could really cause all sorts of difficulties in how we feel about ourselves in terms of illness, wellness, and so on. They could become partially self-fulfilling. If you predict a certain kind of interoceptive state, that prediction will be in a position to begin to bring about that kind of interocepted state, just like we saw in the case of, predicting the face looking outwards in the hollow mask case and so on. So there's a sense in which some predictions get to be partially self-fulfilling in these models, and that's a good way into these issues. Yeah, so we can quit that, and there's Lisa Barrett. So, they take this into some delicate but interesting areas. So in a rather high-profile New York Times piece, they suggest that interoceptive predictions could play a role in stuff like the police shootings of unarmed black men. Just in that sense that if you find yourself as a police officer in a dark alley, and therefore you have a lot of interoceptive signals of anxiety and arousal coming in, and you get some extraceptive evidence, there's a certain kind of shape being drawn at a certain level, then maybe when you bring the sort of interoceptive stuff and the extraceptive stuff together, you might end up generating a clear percept of something that actually isn't there, a clear percept of something like a held weapon when actually maybe it's a held cell phone. This is clearly an important but delicate area. So this is what they say. In a dangerous high-pressure situation, such as a possible crime scene, it's conceivable that some police shooters actually see a weapon when none is present, or as a philosopher would say, actually seem to see a weapon when none is present. So, but importantly, the idea wouldn't be that there's, if you like, something fuzzy that is rapidly but wrongly inferred to be a weapon. Instead, it would be, no, there's something that is very clearly seen to look like a weapon, and that's because of this crunching together of interoceptive information with extraceptive evidence. So this is, again, it will be rather like the case of listening to the familiar song in the noisy shower or on a bad radio. That sort of thing where your priors are playing a big role in bringing something into focus, but in this case, misfocus. So that's what they want to say, it's pretty clear. This explains the tendency of your feelings to influence what you see, not what you think you see, but the actual content of your perceptual experience. And there are other examples of this in other domains. You can see it, or something like it, in some sort of more controlled domains. So there's some nice experiments here in which there's an emotion-inducing stimulus presented to the suppressed eye. So you're getting something over here like let's say it's a happy one. It's a happy face over here. But that information is being suppressed by this sort of technique of flashing lots of Mondrian type stuff across the dominant eye. And at the end of that thing, what happened was that the unseen faces, that's to say these ones, which are masked by the Mondrian stuff there, that the unseen faces influenced people's bodily activity, for example, how fast their hearts were beating, and their stories, these in turn influenced their perceptions. So in the presence of the unseen scowling face, our subjects felt unpleasant and perceived the neutral face as less likeable, less trustworthy, less competent, less attractive, and more likely to commit a crime than they would in the other condition where it would have been paired with a neutral face. So, something that you're not seeing consciously, that perhaps is activating internal states in you nonetheless, could be feeding in to the Bayesian crunch that brings about the conscious percept. That's, I think, a way of saying it. And there are other experiments here. These have done things like manipulating our own sort of estimations of our own current cardiac state, so you can be given false cardiac feedback made to think that your heart's beating faster than it is or slower than it is. And in those conditions, subjects perceive neutral phases as more emotionally intense. So, you think, okay, I'm getting this fast heart-beating information, it must mean something. Maybe it means that this face is not as neutral as all that. I'm getting this right now. So they conclude the brain is wired for prediction, and you predict most of the sights, sounds and other sensations in your life. You are in large measure the architect of your own experience. So that's from their New York Times piece. Okay, so we'll breathe on that for a minute. So I think that is fine as far as it goes. But it's important to be careful here, because the you that is issuing these flows of prediction is not a kind of unitary you. I mean, if you like, your conscious expectations, insofar as they get into the picture here, are just very much the tip of the iceberg. So, for example, you might know all about this story about introception and so on, and still experience all the effects for good or for ill of these kinds of manipulation. Maybe I know all about the sort of cardiac influence on my perception of neutral faces. Won't necessarily make a difference when you put me in that situation. I think what that suggests is something really important, which is that the structure of predictions and estimations of the reliability of errors with respect to predictions is a very deep multi-layered thing. So a lot of the expectations that are generating my experience aren't really my expectations, you know, they're just their expectations that are operating inside me. That makes a lot of good functional sense. You know, obviously, if you think about something like vision, seems to involve an awful lot of soft constraint satisfaction. You need to trade lots and lots and lots of small indicators off against each other in parallel. Clearly, as a conscious agent, you would find that totally impossible to do. It would just be crazy of the brain to allow your expectations about the world as a conscious agent to undo all of those sort of micro predictions and micro precision estimations that are so important for constructing your experience, making it the way that it is. So I don't think it is so surprising that a lot of this stuff is kind of not undone by top-level expectations. You know, you might think it's a big story about predictions, so change what you predict in that some conscious sense, and you're going to change everything. I don't think that's true. I think the same sort of story would need to be told for issues that people do often raise about Muller-Meyer illusions and stuff like that. You know, why is it that when you know that those lines are the same length, nonetheless you still can't see them as being the same length? It's clearly true. Your top-down predictions are not able to overwhelm that nicely sort of rendered microstructure of predictions. So I think there's this whole microstructure of prediction and precision estimation that we really need to take very seriously. Another place where I think we might get evidence of this is in the sort of surprising efficacy of honest placebos. So this is kind of interesting stuff. You know, you can be told that you're being given a placebo, and nonetheless you still get good effects from it. So you might get some relief or some analgesia, even if you know that you're being given an inert substance. It doesn't seem to matter how you're given it. You know, it has to be sort of given by someone that seems to have authority. Perhaps they're wearing a white gown, or the packaging has to be pretty good for this pill you're being given. So maybe what's going on there is that this other stuff is just making its recruiting predictions at these intermediate levels, the sort of multiple micro levels of prediction. Okay. So all those intermediate levels, no matter what you know, you the top level agent, they're still busy making their predictions about what's going to be efficacious and what isn't, basically on the basis of packaging and presentation. Okay, so yes, let's just say what I think I just said. So, agency and higher cognition. So again, I'm going to do this bit rather quickly to get to some of these problems that I want to get to. But you might so far say, okay, so you can begin to say a little something about conscious experience. You haven't solved Dave Chandler's heart problem, but if you thought there was a heart problem in the first place, you'll never solve it. Maybe you get closer. But still, there's a lot more to cognition even than all of that. There's, you know, motivations, goals, long-term projects. Surely they're not predictions as well. And I suppose the last thing I want to do here, sort of positively, is just to confess that in these models they are predictions as well. So you could say, you know, where do these goals come from? How do they make things happen? And The proposal here is that long-term goals are high-level, long-time scale predictions. So action at every time scale here, not just the sort of short time scales of motor action that we looked at mostly last time. Action at all time scales will be making the world conform to some of your predictions. So the short time scale stuff, already saw how that worked last time around. Proprioceptive predictions about sort of visceral, sensory muscular stuff, if you like, they're used as a proxy for motor commands in these stories. The idea is you predict a certain flow of sort of sensory muscular sensation, and in order to get rid of prediction errors with respect to that flow, you move your arm in the predicted way. You bring that movement about. So that's a picture for ordinary motor control that we looked at. But you could say, well, but why predict any flow of proprioceptive sensation, or indeed, why predict anything? You know, how do we get this ball rolling? And just to stick with the confession here, okay, I think the thought is it's predictions all the way up. Action guiding proprioceptive predictions are caused by higher level predictions. So, what's at the higher levels there? I think one of the interesting possible ingredients up there, I think it actually has to be one of the ingredients up there, is counterfactual prediction. So what's counterfactual prediction? I mean, all prediction is kind of counterfactual in some sense, I suppose, otherwise it wouldn't really be a prediction. But the idea here is that counterfactual or fictive stuff here is tracking what you would experience, what you would infer about the world, were you to act in it in a certain way. So if you like, I kind of turn up in my own predictive model of the world as a sort of node, where when I know about a latent variable, where when I know stuff about how I might act on the world, then I can infer stuff about how my sensory barrage would change in response to those actions. So I have a model of how my own model would be updated if I was to do such and such. And you know, at a short time scale, that seems perfectly reasonable. So it's probably important to say this. I mean, this makes you a sort of interesting kind of hidden cause. So there's lots of hidden causes of the perturbations that hit my sensory surfaces. Most of those hidden causes I don't really control very well. You know, if that door just opens, I don't have much control over that. I've just got to process that information. But in terms of when I turn up as a latent variable in my own model, then I've got a lot of control over how the sensory barrage will vary as a result of what's about to happen. So, you know, there's a certain closeness here, I think, of this move towards a high-level counterfactual prediction story and a sense of agency, a sense of being able to do things in the world, and indeed, in the long time scale, being able to bring my own projects to fruition. So your future goals could now be approached by sensible policies. These will be prediction complexes that entrain sequences of actions, each of which delivers sensory consequences that bring you a bit closer to some goal. I don't know, maybe it's, I know you want to sail a yacht around the world, and so you predict that you're going to pass your yacht master exam, and that prediction then trains stuff at a more local level, like you start to predict that you're going to engage in flashcard practice whenever you can, and then when you spot one of those opportunities, sensory motor stuff engages flashcard practice, and off you go. That will be the kind of picture. Predictions at many, many levels, many time scales in training action. This is a picture of the sort of contextualization of control by higher and higher level beliefs. And there's a nice paper by Pazuzu, Wrigley and Friston on this just out about a year ago. But you could still say, okay, so that's good. So, you know, why do you even want to sail a yacht around the world or something? So where did those high-level predictions come from? And of course, some might be innate, some might be acquired early in life. But really, the main thing we have to think about there, I think, is the way that we move through all these sort of weird designer worlds that we humans create, worlds of art, literature, culture. So we move through those worlds, what we're really doing is installing expectations about our own future movements through those worlds. And those expectations on these sorts of stories are what actually brings those movements through those worlds about. And of course that can become increasingly isolated from anything that looks like homeostatic biological bedrock. This is adapting something that's in that Zulu paper. I might expect to go for a meal after a talk, even if I'm really not hungry anymore. You know, that's just entirely fine. So, just to sum all that up, what I can now call PP max, because I'm just trying to give you that feel that, you know, these accounts are just trying to say something about everything. They depict a deeply unified processing regime spanning perception, motivation, cognition, emotion and action, all held together by this common currency of predictions, prediction errors and their variable precision weightings. Those are the three moving parts, if you like, from which all of these things get constructed. And of course implicit there is the generative model that issues the predictions. So, sense in which this is just saying it's ambitious, I think, you know. The alchemists had 4 basic elements to construct everything from, and predictive processing has 3. Predictions, prediction errors, and the variable weighting of prediction errors, precisions. So, breathe on that one. So what I'm going to do, now that I've confessed how big the story is supposed to be, is look at some reasonable worries to have about that story. So one reasonable worry, very popular worry, is that there's something overly conservative about this whole story, particularly once you punch it all the way up to your sort of biggest, your biggest long-term motivations, projects, and so on. The idea is that, well, if all you're trying to do is to bring about the world that you expect, and moment by moment you're minimizing prediction error, maybe this is something too conservative, a recipe for sticking with the expected. So what about all these things that we like to do? You know, we don't just seek out a dark room and stay there. There's a nice dark corner over here, you know. So nice. I could go into that dark corner and just kind of get used to that, successfully predict the ongoing darkness. You might think this is what my brain's really after. But that would be a misunderstanding of the PP story. For so many reasons, it's almost hard to know where to begin, but I'll run through a few of them. I think that, as it were, the not dying in the dark corner thing is really, really overdetermined. It's overdetermined that we don't. Okay. So, a lot of it is resolved just by having introspective prediction. You know, I don't expect not to eat, I don't expect not to drink. So obviously that's going to push me around. Perhaps I chronically predict that I'll seek out food and water. Maybe I chronically predict a certain amount of company. So the darkened room doesn't look like it's going to be a death trap, but you know, you might still sort of worry that it's not quite reconstructing the whole richness of human experience. But you can soon pump this up a bit. You can say, well, you know, maybe biological brains like mine are sort of preset to expect some doses of play, novelty seeking and exploration. That's what you would expect from evolved solutions to the exploit, explore kind of issues. Also, maybe maybe I'm preset to like, this is a sort of interesting recent suggestion, maybe I'm preset to like the minimization of prediction error. So it could be that I'm preset to actually not, as it were, just minimize prediction error, but to seek out good trajectories of minimization of prediction error. If that were true, then, as it were, just getting prediction error down to 0 wouldn't satisfy me. What I want to do is be on the slope. Like that. Interesting middle. I think there's another more characteristically sort of human thing that is playing a big role here, and that's surely just the material world that we live in. I think we are very, very good, this came up a bit last time, at structuring our physical and social worlds in ways that just move the goalposts for our own prediction-based learning and then prediction-based acting. So, you know, we build new stuff, and that new stuff builds new people that predict the new stuff. That. Maybe it's easier just to do it that way. You know, we build new things, and those new things alter our expectations, and so we're not, if you like, approaching the same goal all the time. So I I think there's loads of ways out of the darkened room. Lots and lots and lots of ways out of the darkened room. Introception, expectations of play and novelty, stuff which is just pushed upon us from the outside because we built worlds that actually, as it were, force us to want more novelty perhaps than is biologically natural for us. You know, maybe we've actually constructed worlds that are particularly weird about pushing ourselves around here. Second puzzle, this stuff about the big unifying potential. You might very well worry that we're kind of sticking too much into a little pink shoebox. You might think that we've only bought this sort of unifying story by forcing lots of things which are really fundamentally different into this little single way of talking about stuff in terms of predictions, prediction errors, and so on. And I think I'm kind of sympathetic to that. So probably I may be slightly, maybe Carl and I slightly disagree about this. I don't know. I'm slightly sympathetic to this. It does seem to me that one of the things that goes on here, for better or for worse, is forcing stuff that isn't totally naturally thought of as prediction into a box in which that's the kind of way that you're going to talk about it. So think about the proprioceptive predictions that act as motor commands. You wouldn't have to talk about them that way. You could talk about proprioceptive reference signals that determine set points, equilibrium points for motor control. It's the same story. Same for interoceptive predictions. You could recast those as homeostatic and allostatic set points. Or think about treating my intentions as high-level predictions. Not everyone finds that very natural. You think, well, I've got an intention, but surely that's a very different thing to why describe intentions as predictions? Aren't we just straining the familiar meaning of prediction too far? That list, I think, could go on and on. There's a kind of philosophy of science version of this worry. So Colombo and Hartman have a nice paper on this. They sort of worry that unification is not a scientifically respectable goal. So their kind of argument is, look, physics doesn't make progress by seeking unification. This is the kind of line that they have. Instead, you just embrace multiple models, even if those models are inconsistent with one another. Just embrace multiple models to get things done. So maybe we should let 1,000 explanatory flowers bloom. I think that bit's wrong. I wouldn't go there. But what we can take seriously away from that is that the brain, whatever else the brain is, it's not a homogeneous device. So you might think because the brain isn't a homogeneous device, then why should we expect there to be a fundamental operating principle in there at all? Isn't it just a bag of different kinds of tricks? This is quite a nice paper actually on integration of deep learning and neuroscience. So this is a topic for future work, so that's to say I haven't really got a good answer. But I do think that this worry just gets things upside down. To me, the attraction of these stories is that they provide a vocabulary in which you can sort of translate between all of these perspectives and experimental and theoretical perspectives that we already have a lot of experience with and we know are very powerful. And then when you bring these stories into play, you start revisiting all of that stuff with prediction as a kind of sort of extra layer that you need to take into account all the time. And I think between those two things, there's an awful lot of value there, even if at the same time you're kind of having to force stuff a little bit in order to use that vocabulary convincingly to yourself all the time. So maybe there's a sort of way of sort of respecting diversity here while showing how everything works together. Maybe the upshot of taking this seriously isn't to ditch these other perspectives and say, look, all we need are the sort of, predictions, prediction errors and the precision of prediction errors. Instead, we'll keep all these other perspectives, but we'll use this vocabulary to show how those perspectives interrelate, how they get together. PP, if you like, as a kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding the mind. So I don't know. I think there's a possible research program in there. Okay, and then one last worry, and then I'll start. The last worry is quite closely related. It's basically a sort of falsifiability worry. So you could say that, you know, this sort of perspective rather easily sucks up a lot of other perspectives. Does that by translating everything into this common language of generative model-based prediction, prediction error, waiting on prediction error. Super flexible, but doesn't that make it equally difficult to falsify? So what do you say about that? I think that at least the way that I would want to go with that is to say that at the most abstract level, it won't be at all clear how to falsify this sort of story. You know, at the sort of abstract philosophical level of description, actually the level that I've been giving you most of the time. It's going to be very, very hard to know just what it takes to falsify this. But every serious bit of this story, every time I've appealed to a proposal about introception or about perception or any of those things, they always have a sort of an implied implementation in neural and bodily machinery, and at that level it's always testable. So what we have to do is proceed case by case, trying to check the implementation proposals. The implementation proposals that will say, you know, prediction error is being computed by this bit of the system. We expect therefore to find this sort of profile in this bit of the system. So this isn't easy. It requires devising experiments that are mostly not devised at the moment. Experiments that sort of disentangle the effects of prediction and precision estimation from lots of other effects. But although it's difficult, I think it can certainly be done. So I'll mention one experiment that I think has done it, and then wind up. So it's been possible to test the idea that FFA, the famous fusiform face area, so there's one thought about FFA, which is it's like a feature detector for faces. Sort of downstream feature detector, so the more convinced I am that I'm seeing a face, or the more face information I'm getting, the more it should be on. Let's get that the right way. So some recent work, fairly recent work, I think is rather nice here, actually shows that FFA is best understood really as being in the business of face prediction rather than face feature detection. This is work from Egnamonti and Summerfield a while back. What they did is compared the sort of simple bottom-up feature detection model here, sort of, you know, I, in a bottom-up way, kind of detect features and progressively accumulate evidence for the presence of those features. They tested this against the sort of top-down predictive coding story about what might be going on in FFA. So the feature detection model predicts that FFA response should scale with the presence of face evidence. They collected data, fMRI data from FFA, while independently varying both the presented features, is it a face or is it a house, and the degree of face expectation in the subject. So you could have low, medium or high expectation that you're about to see a face. That was set up, doesn't really matter for our purposes, however, it was set up using these little frames, and the colours of these frames actually carried information about the likelihood that it was going to be a face that you saw next. And you thought that you were performing a different task, which was spot the upside down things. So that doesn't matter, it's just to give you something to do really. Okay. So what they found is FFA response was maximally differentiated, that's to say the face versus house response, was maximally different only under very low face expectation. Given either a face or a house as the actual incoming evidence, under high face expectation, you actually couldn't tell the difference at FFA. So FFA just seems to be, if you like, mostly a high face expectation area rather than anything else. In fact, they're best, so they tried lots of this sort of Bayesian model comparison here, tried lots of ways of modelling the data that they got, and they found that the predictive coding model here the best model used a weighting in which face surprise, face prediction error, contributed twice as much to the fMRI, the bold signal, as did face expectation, the representation units. So I thought would be, you know, most of the activity there is, if you like, face expectation, face surprise activity. This is Lars Muckley commenting on this sort of this kind of stuff. Processing sensory stimulation might be the minor task of the cortex, whereas its major task is to predict upcoming stimulation as precisely as possible. That's the kind of picture you're getting there. FFA really a face prediction area rather than a face recognition area. And there's lots of other studies using different experimental paradigms. I just mentioned that one because I think it was particularly elegant, particularly nice. Bottom line is, you test the model by applying it case by case in ways that make contact with suggested neural implementations. I don't see any other way to test it. That means you can't test all of it. You know, you have to test it bit by bit. And if things keep going well, then we can keep talking about this. So, lots of outstanding issues. You know, there's a Dave Chalmers issue. Why is there conscious experience at all? Can predictive processing really help us with regard to this so-called hard problem? I hope it can, because we've got a 4-year ERC grant to look at this. We haven't started it yet. We started in January. So we'll spend 4 years looking at this, but through a slightly deflationary lens, which is the kind of thing, once you can account for everything that we say and do, when we say stuff about our own experience and we do stuff, then if you account for all of that, you've just accounted for conscious experience. There's no extra. That's the sort of deflationary approach. It's a kind of Dennett approach, really. So anyway, there's that issue. Why is there conscious experience at all? Secondly, sort of a kind of more machine learning issue, is the PP sort of way of combining top-down and bottom-up information really the right way to go? So the PP way is a very clear, very elegant way of doing it. Only prediction errors get sent forward. But there are loads of different ways you could combine top-down and bottom-up information, and some people in machine learning like to look at other ways of combining top-down and bottom-up information. Something that's going to make it really hard to sort this out, I think, is that variable precision estimations are going to basically enable you to get out just about any profile here that you like. So I'm not actually quite sure how testable this issue is, or indeed whether it's a real issue or not. But certainly my Edinburgh colleagues in machine learning think it's a real issue. They think it's one we should be thinking about. And lastly, you know, how do social and cultural influences sculpt our predictive brains, and could we use that knowledge in a way that might let us do better in these sorts of rather delicate socio-political cases that people like Barrett and so on are talking about? So they're the things I think remain to be done. I think the good news here is that we can use this. At least it's good news for philosophers. I don't think it's good news for everyone. It's good for philosophers. We can use this to ask questions about the nature of perception, thought, emotion and action and how they all fit together. It's a chance to revisit lots of fundamental issues, I think. A real glimpse, this is what I believe, I actually like it a lot. I think it's a glimpse of the common threads and processing motifs that bring together a huge variety of superficially different cognitive phenomena. So that's where I think the unifying power really is. And above all, maybe it's an opportunity to understand ourselves better. So I think we do very easily start to understand ourselves better as creatures whose percepts reflect this delicate balancing act between what we expect to be coming in and what we get in evidence is actually coming in. And when you see some of those expectations as sort of being directed at your own visceral states, and also the whole crunch of expectations bringing about actions, which then bring in new sensory barrages, maybe it's just me, but that's kind of what it feels like to be human to me. So I think this balancing act reveals what Jakob von Uxküll rather nicely describes as a human Umwelt, the world as it matters right now to an embodied agent with a particular history. So this is like, this was a honeybee's Umwelt in this sort of rather pretty picture. This is the astronomer's Umwelt. You can kind of see how it goes. The stuff that's salient, the stuff that matters, brought into focus by crunching all of this information together in a multi-level system, moment by moment. So good. That is actually the end. Thank you very much for